"Jungkook, let's break up." She bit her lip to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. How could she look into those eyes that had once made her feel like she was the center of this world? She couldn't. "Why, what's going on? What happened so suddenly?" "We were fine, weren't we?" he asked softly. His voice wavered with desperation. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edges of her sleeves. Her heart pounded heavily in her chest, each beat a reminder of the agony she was forcing herself to endure. "I have fallen out of love." Her face was devoid of any emotion. Jungkook stared at her for a while and then laughed with agony. "I don't believe it, Wine." He shook his head and said, his voice barely above whisper, "If you don't leave that John guy, I swear I'll destroy everything he's working for. He'll have nothing left. John's family is already penniless. They have gone bankrupt and everyone has turned their backs on them." The conversation with her grandpa echoed in her mind. "You can't do this, Grandpa," he chuckled evilly. "I can, Wine. If I can send goons and shoot him, then I can do anything." Her eyes widened in disbelief. Your people shoot him." Her voice cracked. He nodded, leaving her in utter shock. "Don't forget he's the only man in John's family and he has 3 beautiful sisters. You know your cousins admires beautiful girls." The meaning underneath his words burned fury within her. "Can't you be less disgusting?" He slapped her across the face and grabbed her hair. "Break off with him or get ready for his funeral in an hour, and don't you dare to speak a word to him about our conversation. Wine, I am asking you something. Where have you been lost?" He shook her shoulders. Wine stared at his face, trying to find words that would shatter them both. The weariness of his gaze, the image of him tirelessly rebuilding his father's company after their bankruptcy, his sleepless nights, his relentless drive, it all played before her eyes like a cruel movie. He had already lost so much and she couldn't be the reason he lost even more. But this was killing her. "Wine, I have come this far just because of you. Please don't leave me," he murmured through teary eyes and cupped her face, forcing her to look at him. "Jungkook," she pushed away his hands, "I don't love you anymore. Besides, you are weak by status. I'm used to living a luxury life while you are still trying to build back everything. I can't wait for you anymore. I have received a proposal for marriage from San's family's elder son, Edward Sands, and I have accepted it. It's better if you accept it." Jungkook's eyes widened in disbelief as he stepped backward. He clenched his jaw, pain flashing across his face. "Is it true? What's going on? Please, Jungkook, you're so annoying. Isn't it enough that I don't love you anymore?" She swallowed hard. Her heart screamed at her to stop, to confess everything, to throw herself into his arms and let him hold her until the world made sense again. But the weight of her grandfather's threat pressed down on her, reminding her why she couldn't. Her grandfather's cold eyes flashed in her mind. If she told him the truth, Jungkook would fight for them and she couldn't let him. She couldn't let him lose everything because of her. The sound of the door creak open and close snapped her back to the present. She wiped her face, seeing Suzanne. "What happened, Miss Wine? Do you need something?" she asked worriedly and rushed to her. "Suzanne, can you help me take a bath?" she mumbled embarrassingly. Suzanne stared at her with a pitiful gaze. "Sure, why not? Anyway, I came for it." Suzanne helped her sit, but Wine's muscles and bones screamed in protest, making her groan in pain. She gulped and calmed herself as Suzanne stared at her with concern. "Why?" she asked, confused as Edward would deliberately leave her helpless and give tons of work to Suzanne, leaving Wine in bed for several days. "Let's get you a bath first." Wine nodded as Suzanne helped her sit old wheelchair and dragged her into the washroom. The warmth of the bath water soon soothed the pain that had long become a constant companion. Suzanne then dressed her in a soft, clean clothes. For a brief moment, Wine felt human again. She clutched the locket in her hand. Suzanne stared at her thoughtfully as she combed her hair. As usual, she couldn't help but ask, "Miss Wine, is he worth your love?" Wine smiled, brought the locket to her heart and closed her eyes. He is worth every piece of me, every heartbeat, every tear, every smile, every pain. He is a piece of my soul. Loving him feels like walking among the stars, weightless and timeless, as if the universe itself bends just to let us exist in this perfect harmony. He is not just worth it, he is the reason love feels like something divine, something beyond this world. Wine never said what was his name or who he was. Susan just knew that her unconditional love for him was the reason for Wine's day today. What does he look like? Like the first rays of dawn, soft yet bright, as if the world is painting itself in colors just for him. How does it feel being with him? Being with him is like standing in the eye of a storm, chaotic all around yet safe and calm at the center, where his presence wraps around me like a gentle, unspoken promise. How does his voice sound? His voice is like the melody of rain on a quiet night, soothing yet stirring something deep within me, as though each word he speaks unravels the very core of my heart. Somewhere from afar his laugh echoed in her ear, but it soon faded. What does he mean to you? He is the reason I am still breathing. He is the echo of my silence and the rhythm to my heartbeats. In a world full of noise, he is the one truth I seek. Is he really that special? Special isn't enough to describe him. He is the very essence of what love should feel like. The reason even the stars invite the way he made me glow. There was a brief moment of silence between them until Wine opened her eyes and spoke, her voice hoarse. Susan. Susan hummed, snapping out of her thoughts. I'm scared, Susan. I don't want to forget how his voice, his laugh, but now it seemed to be blurring in my mind. I want to see him for the last time. I don't want to die yet. She wept uncontrollably. I'm envious of him. How could someone love as much as you love him? You gave up on your everything for him. One stared at an invisible point as tears streamed down her face. She could still hear her grandpa's cold voice and ruthless words. Why don't you marry Edward? Can you imagine how much profit will we get from the sands? He growled. Profit, money, wealth. Is this all that matters to you? I will not marry Edward. You wanted me to break up with Jungkook and forget him, but I can't bring myself to accept this. Mr. Kang nodded, losing his temper. Fine, you'll pay for this. He then gestured to his men. Give her 50 whips and send her to Sans mansion. We disown her. Inform Edward they can keep her as a slave. Wine was in shock, her legs went numb. All the property that belongs to you is ours. Take her to the basement and keep her locked there until Edward comes and takes her. Wine let out a sigh. From those days until today she was living a nightmare. Susan, give me those gloves to cover my hands. She fisted her hands as her fingers ached terribly. Why don't you wear these gloves which I gave you? Wine smiled gloomily. That's a token of your mom, Susan. Keep it safe with you. She nodded, pursing her lips. Miss Wine, there's something I want to tell you. Susan sat in front of her and said hesitantly, What's it? She bit her lips before speaking. Mr. Sands sold you off. They're coming to take you. Wine's heart sank to her feet, her eyes widened in fear. Susan was on the verge of crying. No, please, I can't go. Please help me. She whispered, her voice trembling as tears began to fall freely. I'm sorry, I wish I could help you. Susan whispered, holding her hands as tears rolled down her eyes. Can my life be any worse? I think it's the end of me, Susan. I might just die now. Susan shook her head. No, don't say that. You have to see him. How can you give up so easily? Easily? She whispered and chuckled bitterly. 5 years, Susan. 5 years of pain, mental, physical, and emotional. I'm such a tough soul. I didn't die even after enduring such pain. I lost the ability to walk. I have broken bones and unhealed wounds, yet I am enduring it all. I'm tired. She spoke wearily and closed her eyes. Susan sobbed silently, staring at her face. Susan, help me out of here or kill me. Before Susan could speak, the door was thrown open and Edward stormed in, his face twisted with contempt. Without a word, he stroked her hard across the face. the force of the blow sending shockwaves of pain through her already fragile body. Wayne gasped, her head swimming with the impact as she tasted blood in her mouth. "Shut up, don't even think of it. I won't hesitate to kill this Suzanne." He spat with disdain, pointing his gun at Suzanne. Wayne shook her head. "No, please spare her, she's innocent," she cried. "So are you." Suzanne turned to Edward. "Kill me, sir, but please let her go. Have some mercy on her." Suzanne cried, sitting in his feet, and begged. "Suzanne." Edward kicked Suzanne and was about to speak when 3 to 4 men entered the room. "Where is the girl?" Blood drained from Wayne's face seeing those scary guys. "Here she is, take her." They exchanged glances at each other with unreadable expression as they looked upon Wayne's paralyzed form. One of them lifted her roughly without a word. Wayne felt extreme pain in her bones. The world became a blur as they carried her away, her mind filled with terror and dread. The last thing she heard was Suzanne's cries. Time skipped. Hours later, Wayne found herself in a dimly lit room, the silence deafening around her. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes burning from crying. She didn't know where she was or what awaited her, but the fear gnawed at her insides. She clutched the locket to her chest when a knock came at the door, and a maid entered. "Excuse me, could you please help me sit?" The maid stared at her with a frown. "I can't, I'm disabled." The maid swiftly came towards her and helped her sit. "Can you please check if my wheelchair is here?" "Sure, I'll go and check, but Miss Boss wants to see you." Wayne's heart trembled at the mention of the boss. As the maid made her way out to the hall, she crossed paths with Jungkook. He stood with a poker face. His eyes glinted with something dark as he approached her. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice calm but dangerous, making her shudder. "She is in the room, boss." The maid replied hesitantly, unsure of what his intentions were. "Didn't I tell you to send her to me?" he growled. "Boss, he cut in. "Shut up, I'll see her," he said and made his way to Wayne's room. Jungkook's jaw clenched as memories of the pain Wayne had caused him flooded back. After all the hurt she had caused him, after tearing him apart, this was his moment. Now it was her turn to suffer. Jungkook barged into the room, his presence commanding and filled with fury. For a moment, they both froze. Wayne's eyes widened, unable to believe it was really him. Her heart raced wildly as she stared at him without blinking, as if he would disappear if she blinked. Jungkook too was struck silence. He had come in ready to face the woman who had hurt him, ready to exact his revenge, but the sight before him wasn't the Wayne he remembered. She looked like a shadow of herself, skin clinging to her bones, dark shadows under her eyes, her face drained of all life. As if the person he had once known had been sucked dry, leaving behind only a fragile shell. Composing himself quickly, Jungkook straightened and plastered a smirk on his face. His eyes darkened with a twisted mixture of anger and something deep as he crossed the room. Well, how does it feel, Wayne, to be betrayed by your loved one, by someone whom you trusted the most?" Wayne remained silent, her hollow eyes staring at him as if she were looking at something distant, far beyond the room. The smirk on Jungkook's face faltered slightly when she didn't respond. The emptiness in her gaze unnerved him more than he cared to admit. "I'll make you pay for the damage you caused me," he said sharply, grabbing her arm harshly and yanking her towards him. But as soon as he did, Wayne gasped in pain, her body too weak to handle the sudden force. She fell limply on the floor. In the meantime, the maid entered with the wheelchair. The locket from Wayne's hand fell. She swiftly picked it, but it didn't go unnoticed by Jungkook. He was in utter shock. "Miss Wayne." She hurried to her and tried to lift her. Jungkook stood frozen. He stared at the wheelchair, then back at Wayne, his heart thundering in his chest as the realization hit him like a freight train. She was paralyzed. Wayne groaned, placing her hand on her upper abdomen. Jungkook reached out and lifted her in his arms. She was as light as feather. He gently laid her on the bed. The moment of whirlwind of emotions flooded him. Nostalgia, grief, guilt, all tangled together. suffocating him as he felt the weight of her in his arms. She was so light, so different from the strong, fairy woman he had once known. The one who had once hurt him, betrayed him, was now barely hanging on to life. He turned around to leave, but she gripped his wrist. "You want revenge? Kill me then," she mumbled, looking deep into his eyes. Her smile and hollow eyes clenched his heart. He gently freed his hand from her grip and walked out. Wine closed her eyes with a smile. First time in 5 years, she felt genuinely happy. Few days later, Jungkook had gone and didn't return since then. For days, Jungkook had been tormented by the image of Wine in that state. The thought of her lifeless gaze haunted him, making it impossible to focus on anything else. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Everything felt wrong. He didn't know how to make sense of it. This gnawing ache in his chest that wouldn't go away. Meanwhile, Wine was lost in thoughts all day, staring at the walls. In San's mansion, she at least had Susan with her to talk her heart out, but here, she wasn't familiar with anyone. Now Wine was in the living room when she heard the sudden commotion outside. The door burst open and Jimmy San stormed in. "Wine? Jimmy?" she muttered with surprise. Jimmy drew close to her and kneeled before her. "I'm glad you're fine," he mumbled with relief. "I'm sorry I'm late. My family deliberately sent me overseas so that I couldn't help you." He gently held her hand. "I know, but how did you come here? Does Edward know? He won't spare you." She spoke worriedly. Jimmy smiled, shaking his head. "No one knows. Butler told me that Edward has sold you off. I couldn't help but rush back. Now you don't have to worry about anything. I'll take you out of here safely." Wine stared at him for a brief moment and pulled out her hand. "I'm fine, Jimmy. Don't worry about me. Just take care of Susan for me. She's still young. I don't want Edward to vent my anger on her." Jimmy couldn't help but frown. "Wine, are you scared of that bastard John? I'll take you out of here safely. Trust me." Before Wine could speak, a cold voice rang out. "I dare you to take her away." Jimmy and Wine both turned to see Jungkook standing in the doorway, his eyes hard and unyielding. His presence was like ice in the room, freezing everything in its path. Without another word, Jimmy charged at Jungkook, his anger flaring, but Jungkook easily dodged the blow, stepping to the side with a practiced ease. Jimmy stumbled, his anger only growing. "I'm letting you go just this time. Get lost from here." Jimmy was about to throw a blow, but Wine's voice stopped him. "Jimmy, don't." He glanced at her helplessly when they both heard Susan's words. "Miss Wine," Susan cried, rushing to Wine's side. "Susan," she said with a smile and surprise. Susan hugged her. "Are you okay?" she said, gazing at her head to toe. Wine nodded, her eyes shimmered with tears. "Mr. Sands," she then turned to Jimmy. "What are you doing here, Susan?" He grabbed her arm and pulled her close. "Mr. John brought me here to take care of Miss Wine." Wine and Jimmy both glanced at Jungkook, who was standing with an indifferent expression. "Edward?" He passed Susan a questioning gaze. "Mr. John dealt with him. Mr. John is really a good man," she said in a low tone with a smile. Jimmy glared at her, making her flustered. "Now, Mr. Sands, I would advise you to leave because I have important matters to attend to." Jimmy glanced at Wine, who nodded at him. He let out a sigh. "Susan, take care of Wine and yourself. I'll come around next time." Susan nodded with a smile. Jimmy hesitated before staring at Susan for a brief moment and walking out. "Susan, the car is ready. Go and sit. We are coming." Susan's smile widened as she glanced at Wine, who stared at them confusedly. She then walked away while Jungkook strode to Wine and lifted her in his arms. "What are you doing?" she asked, flustered, and wiggled in his hold. Jungkook stared at her pale face. "Stay still, we are going to the hospital," he said coldly, averting his gaze from her. "But no buts, keep quiet." His tone left no room for argument. Wine shook her head, holding on to him tightly and staring at his side profile. She noticed he usually frowns. Unlike in the past, he would smile all the time. "Don't frown, it will make you look older early," she said in a state of trance. Jungkook's steps faltered for a while, but then he composed himself and smiled inwardly. Won blinked several times and looked away. At hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, the staff immediately took Won in for examination. Jungkook stayed close to her. The doctor asked Won a few routine questions. Jungkook watched as the doctor's face grew more serious with each answer, the concern in his eyes deepening. "We'll need to do a full body X-ray. We need to see the extent of any internal injuries or fractures," the doctor said gently. Won took a deep breath and they wheeled her towards the X-ray room, and Susan and Jungkook followed closely, her face lined with worry. Jungkook stayed by the door, his fist clenched, anxiety eating at him. Susan began helping Won change into the hospital gown. Won moved slowly, wincing with every slight motion, her body clearly in pain. As Susan prepared, her mind hesitated, glancing at where Jungkook stood. "Could you leave?" Her soft voice snapped him back to present. Jungkook stiffened for a moment, but then no returning to leave. He paused at the door, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he stepped out into the hallway. His mind was racing, thoughts jumbling together in a storm of motions. Susan came out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Jungkook's eyes were drawn to the small gap, and without thinking he found himself moving closer. Through the half-open door he could see Won sitting on the examination table, the hospital gown loose around her thin frame. His breath caught in his throat as he noticed ugly jagged scars crisscrossing her back, marring her once smooth skin. His heart clenched painfully, the sight of those scars like a knife twisting in his chest. The questions raced through his mind, each one more agonizing the last. "Susan, what happened to her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with a pain he couldn't hide. Susan turned to him, tears welling up in her eyes. They tortured her, her grandfather and Edward. They locked her in a dark basement for days, punished her, starved her, and beat her. Her soul-piercing screams would echo through the basement, but no one would come to help her. Jungkook felt the ground shift beneath him, the world tilting on its axis. The pain in his heart became unbearable, a crushing weight that threatened to break him. He wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but all he could do was stand there frozen in shock. Why did they do this to her? He asked, his voice hollow, his mind unable to comprehend the cruelty. Susan looked at him with tear-filled eyes, a sad smile tugging at her lips. Because she denied marrying Edward. She sacrificed everything for her love. Jungkook stared at her, his mind reeling. Her love? She nodded, the tears finally spilling over. They threatened her they would kill him and his family if she went against them. Miss Won loves him deeply. She gave up everything. She endured all of this for him. She says she deserved this because she hurt him deeply. Do you know who is he? She shook her head in denial. I never asked his name, but she has a locket. It was gifted by him. He felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He stumbled back, the tears burning in his eyes as he tried to process what she just said now. All of this pain, the torture, the suffering, it all had been all because of him. She even sacrificed her own life for him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She had endured so much for him. She even lost her legs. It shattered something inside him. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his vision blurring as the tears finally broke free. The pain in his heart was too much, too raw, too real. He had come for revenge, but now all he felt was an overwhelming, suffocating sense of loss. At night, Jungkook wandered the hospital corridors for hours, his thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and pain. He couldn't shake the image of Won sacred back from his mind, the sight of her frail body haunting him like a relentless ghost. He couldn't face her. The doctor's words rang in his ear. "Mr. John, we have completed the initial examination. Miss Won is in a fragile state. Her fingers are all fractured, her 3 ribs are broken, and there are other fractures on her body as well. We need to admit her immediately to monitor her condition and start treatment." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. She had endured too much to bear. It pierced like a claw, tearing his insides apart. Jungkook stared at Won's sleeping frame with teary eyes. Never had he cried so much, not even when Won broke up with him. He sat in the chair next to her, his gaze fixed on her sleeping form. Suddenly Wine began to tremble, her small hands clutching at the sheets, her face contorting with fear. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead, and her breath became erratic. Shallow gasps escaping her lips. "No, leave me, please," she whispered. Jungkook reached out to her and patted her feet gently. Tears rolled down her closed eyes. "Wine, wake up." He gently caressed her hair. Wine relaxed, took deep breaths and opened her eyes. She stared at him in a daze. "We are safe," he mumbled, wiping the sweat off her forehead. "Jungkook," she whispered, still in a daze, and brought her hand to touch his face. "I'm here," he whispered back with teary eyes. She touched his face with both her hands, feeling his warmth. She pulled back her hands and looked around. "Where's Suzanne? What are you doing here?" His tears fell on her face, making her surprised. Why? Why did you went through it all alone, Wine? Why did you endure so much? Why, Wine?" He said between sobs, pressing his forehead against hers. Wine covered his face and wiped his tears, but they kept coming. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. If I had known, God, I would never have." She shook her head. "Don't be sorry." She began to cry. They both cried without speaking a word. Jungkook pulled away, sniffing, and wiped her face. He helped her sit and poured the water into the glass, handing it to her. Wine gulped the water and kept the glass aside, her eyes searching for something. "Do you need something?" "Susan must have left my gloves here somewhere." Jungkook frowned, holding her cold hands. "Does it hurt?" "Due to cold temperature." Jungkook brought her hands and rested them on his warm bare chest. Wine shuddered, feeling his muscles. Her face flushed. "I remember you used to be irritated wearing gloves." She smiled faintly. "Everything changes with time." Jungkook stared deep into her eyes and pulled her into a gentle hug. "I promise, Wine, I'll make sure you get the best treatment, the best care. You'll walk again, I swear it. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're okay." He kissed the top of her head and pressed his cheek on it. "I'll never forgive myself. You have been through all this because of me." She pulled away. "I suffered because of my family, not you. You don't have to blame yourself." He leaned down and kissed her chin. "I'll make them pay 20 times what they have done to you." He mumbled, kissing her forehead. "I'm glad you're successful. The way I wanted to see you," she said with a smile, staring at his face with longing. "The thought of you has kept me alive until today. I wanted to see you for one last time this close. Even if I die now, it would." He hushed her. "I won't let anything happen to you. Now it's their time to pay." He kissed her hands. "I don't deserve this sacrifice of yours, Wine. It kills me knowing you are in this state because of me. I'm not worth it." He whispered, his voice filled with agony. Wine leaned and kissed his teary eyes. "You brought light into my dark life, Jungkook. I was a lonely girl with no purpose of living. You gave me a reason to live." He cradled her. "I won't spare anyone who did this to you," he mumbled. "Jungkook, are you a mafia?" "I belong to the underworld." She nodded over his chest. His embrace calmed her mind and nerves. "I missed you so much every moment. Whatever I am today, it's all because of you. My business, wealth, and this lavish life. It's all because of you. I misunderstood you and came back to revenge you. I didn't know I owe you my life. I'm so sorry. Every time I think about it, I hate myself even more. I feel like shooting myself. No more talks about death. I have lived death for 5 years, Jungkook." He tightened his grip around her until enough to not hurt her. He carried her back and asked each detail about 5 years ago. They spent the night in each other's arms talking about the past. Time skip. It had been a month since Wine's treatment began. The doctor warned them that there was a chance that she might never stand again. Wine quietly sat in her wheelchair, staring at the pages of a book, though her thoughts were far from the words printed in front of her. The uncertainty of her future weighed heavily on her heart, and for the first time she wondered what Jungkook truly saw when he looked at her. Was she just a broken version of the person he once loved? The familiar cologne hit her nostrils, snapping her out of her thoughts. As soon as she turned her head to the side, Jungkook lifted her in his arms, taking her off guard. "Jungkook," she gasped, startled as he effortlessly carried her to the bed. "What were you thinking?" He sat in the bed and adjusted her on his lap, gently. Wayne hesitated before speaking. I was thinking maybe you should marry the girl your mom chose for you. She's worried about you. He stared at her face for a while and grabbed her chin. You want me to get married to the girl of mom's choice? She nodded, avoiding his gaze. Well, I'm already married then. He tilted his head to the side slightly, an unreadable smile playing on his lips. Wayne's heart sank, the words hitting harder than she expected. That's a good thing, she managed with a forced smile. Aren't you going to ask who the girl is? She blinked, caught off guard. Who is she? She asked curiously. 𝐶𝐞𝐬 smiled, leaning and placed a soft kiss to her lips. Her face turned crimson as she held his shoulders with a lower head. She's my love, my wine, he whispered and pulled out an envelope from the pocket of his jacket. She stared at him confusedly. You should have checked the papers this morning before signing them. What? These are our marriage registration papers that you signed this morning. He waved it in front of her and kept them aside. Wayne was in utter shock, staring at him with disbelief. We are now legally husband and wife, he said with a smile and pulled out a small velvet box. Are you serious? He chuckled. Never have been so serious. He gently slid the ring into her finger. I bought this 5 years ago. I was going to propose to you then, but we broke up that day. Wayne stared at the ring with teary eyes. 𝐶𝐞𝐬, you heard the doctor said I might never stand again. I don't want to be a burden to you. I don't want to hold you back. And your mom, what about? 𝐶𝐞𝐬's eyes softened as he cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had fallen. You can never be a burden to me. I know I'm not worth it for you, but I'm being selfish. I can't stay away from you anymore. Whether you walk or not doesn't change a thing. As for mom, she just wants me to get married. Whoever the girl is, it doesn't matter to her. He caressed her jawline and trailed his hand down to her neck. His gaze then drifted to the scars that marked her shoulder, the remnants of all the pain she had endured. Without hesitation, he slid the fabric of her shirt down, exposing the scars. Wayne flinched slightly, trying to pull away. Don't, they're ugly, she whispered, holding his hand. 𝐶𝐞𝐬 moved away her hand and leaned down, pressing gentle kisses to each scar, his lips lingering as if he could erase the pain they carried. Wayne's breath caught in her throat, the warmth of his lips against her skin sending a shiver through her. His actions spoke louder than words. She closed her eyes as 𝐶𝐞𝐬 trailed feather-like kisses all over her shoulder to neck. He stopped, noticing her heavy breath, and smiled, burying his face in her neck, kissing it gently. 𝐶𝐞𝐬, he hummed. What was the sound last night? Like screams? He chuckled darkly. That was Edward's scream. He mumbled over her neck. She just nodded, holding him close. Do you want to lie down for a while? Your back must be stiff. No, let's stay like this for a while. He smiled over her neck and hummed. I love you, Wayne. I love you too. She kissed his hair. He snuggled further into her neck. A year later. A year passed, and Wayne's legs were finally healed after 𝐶𝐞𝐬's support and efforts. Edward had been in 𝐶𝐞𝐬's torture cells ever since then. Now Wayne and 𝐶𝐞𝐬 strode side by side into the meeting room of 𝐾𝐻𝐬's, which was filled with thick tension due to their financial crisis. The shareholders went silent, staring at them. Wayne, Mr. 𝐾𝐻𝐬 whispered with disbelief, staring at her wide-eyed. His face paled. Wayne's cold stare cut through the room like a blade. 𝐶𝐞𝐬 threw this thick stack of files on the conference table with a heavy thud. Here's the real owner of this company, John Wayne. The shareholders glanced at each other. For the past few days, they have been hearing about Wayne's arrival and Mr. 𝐾𝐻𝐬's deception. Wayne kept her gaze locked on the old man, who visibly trembled. Mr. 𝐾𝐻𝐬 had stolen what rightfully belonged to her, and now you're going to pay for it. He said the last sentence, passing Mr. 𝐾𝐻𝐬 a cold and dark smile. This is nonsense, this John and Wayne are. 𝐶𝐞𝐬's growl cut him off. These are the proofs of your money laundering, of every illegal deal you have made, every law you have broken to get where you are today. The board won't stand for it, and neither will the shareholders. Wayne's father had built this empire, it's legally hers. The shareholders, now furious, glared at Mr. 𝐾𝐻𝐬 while 𝐶𝐞𝐬 turned to Wayne. Hey princess, why don't you sit? "You'll be tired like this," he said in a soft tone, reaching out to caress her cheek. Wang shook her head with a smile. "I'm fine." "What is this, Mr. Kang? We can't go on with you anymore. We want Miss Wang as chairwoman." Mr. Kang's face drained of color as he realized there was no way out. The meeting ended in a chaos as the shareholders voted to remove Mr. Kang from power and install Wang as the new chairwoman. The old man slumped in his chair defeated. Soon Jungkook dismissed them as they still had to deal with the old man. As soon as the shareholders exited, Jungkook drew close to Mr. Kang with a sharp blade in his hand. "How dare you hurt my moment?" He growled through gritted teeth, his voice low and menacing. He pressed the blade against the old man's throat, making him tremble in fear. "You thought you could get away with it." He drew us apart, tortured her, and handed her to that bastard. Mr. Kang's eyes widened in terror, his breath coming in short, panic gasps. Wang stared at him coldly and held Jungkook's arm. Jungkook let the police handle him. He hesitated, his jaw tightening as he stared at the man who had caused so much pain. But then, with a mocking grin, he moved back. "Enjoy prison. You'll fit right at your age. I'll pay them extra to torture the hell out of you." He pulled the knife away and stepped back, but not before turning to Wang with puppy eyes, his voice suddenly shifting to a playful tone. "You could have let me have a little more fun with him." Wang chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Only if he were a bit younger, maybe." Jungkook slid the blade back into his pocket. "I would have chopped off his limbs and fed them to dogs just like I did to Edward. But anyway, your uncles and their sons won't get away with it." Wang nodded, watching as Mr. Kang scrambled out of the room. "The police are waiting for you downstairs," he said from behind and turned to Wang with a playful grin. "Now that that's over, how about we celebrate?" He moved close, his arms sliding around her waist, pulling her against him and murmuring, his lips brushing against her ear. Wang raised and brow, though her heart raced at the way his fingers trailed teasingly along her sides. "Celebrate? How?" Jungkook smirked, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze, his eyes dark with desire. "I can think of a few ways," he said seductively. Wang's breath hissed as he leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a soft, teasing kiss. His hands slid to her lower back, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened, his body pressing against hers. "You're so beautiful when you're in control. It drives me crazy," he whispered, his lips barely leaving hers as he spoke. She blushed, but she couldn't help the smile that tugged at her lips. "Is that so?" Jungkook grinned, his hands exploring the curve of her waist, sending sparks through her. "You have no idea." He kissed her again, this time more intensely. His hand roamed over her body, possessively and loving, while wine melted into his touch, her fingers tangling in his hair. He lifted her knee, urging her to wrap her around his waist, and walked to the table without breaking the kiss. As soon as they became lost in each other and the world around them faded, they heard a gasp followed by Jimmy's voice. "Get yourself a room. This is not your house," he said annoyedly while Suzanne covered her eyes. Jungkook pulled away with a chuckle while Wine hid her face in his chest out of embarrassment. "It's okay, you can learn something and propose to Suzanne as soon as possible." Jimmy was flustered while Suzanne glanced at him with wide eyes and ran away. Jimmy shook his head. "Come out, the cops wants to question you both." Jungkook hummed in response, letting out a sigh and kissing Wine's temple. Time skip. Wine walked into the room after the last trial of the court had concluded. She plopped down on the bed, her eyes closed for a moment as the soft mattress cradled her tired body. A few moments later, Jungkook entered the room as he finished a conversation over the phone and approached her. Without a word, he knelt by the edge of the bed, gently reaching for her feet. Wine opened her eyes, startled by his touch. "Jungkook, I can do it," she said softly, trying to sit up, but Jungkook just smiled, shaking his head slightly as he carefully undid the straps of her heels. "Let me," he said softly and released her feet. As soon as her feet were free, he massaged them briefly before moving up to remove her earrings, his touch gentle, mindful of her. One smiled gratefully, leaning back against the pillows as he worked. However, before he could finish, his phone buzzed again. "Take the call, I'll change in the meantime," she said softly, sitting up straight. Jungkook hesitated before nodding, and headed to the closet to change. After a few minutes, she re-emerged, now dressed comfortably in a loose shirt and shorts, her hair tied up messily. She glanced over. Jungkook was still on the phone, smiling. Wine padded over to the bed and laid down, resting her head on his lap. He automatically reached for her, his fingers trailing gently through her hair. She let out a soft sigh, closing her eyes. He entered the call and pressed down and kissed her forehead.